Imagine you run a trading company. You source equipment from a Chinese manufacturer, document it as industrial machinery on the shipping manifest, load it onto a vessel, and route it through a third-country intermediary toward a customer whose identity is managed through a chain of shell companies. That is not a hypothetical. That is the documented operational template of hundreds of transactions that have moved sanctioned goods from Chinese suppliers toward Iranian end users over the past decade. The U.S. government has traced that template many times. It has designated individual entities, seized individual shipments, and imposed individual penalties. The system has continued to function because the scale of the trade, the complexity of the logistics chains, and the jurisdictional limits of American enforcement have always outpaced the enforcement response.
The ship the United States just seized is different, not because the dual-use equipment it was carrying is uniquely significant. Dual-use cargo has been moving toward Iran through Chinese logistics chains for years. It is different because of where it was coming from, who owns it, and what the chain of custody documentation reveals about the level of Chinese institutional involvement in this particular shipment. When I say the U.S. China proxy conflict over Iran became direct and undeniable with this seizure, I am using those words with forensic precision. The broken contract at the center of this story is not the sanctions regime Iran has been violating. It is the implicit agreement between Washington and Beijing that Chinese entities would not be directly implicated at a level of institutional involvement that forced the United States to make the connection public. That implicit contract just broke. And the finance-minded person watching this needs to understand what it means, not for the diplomacy, but for the specific mechanism through which Chinese-origin goods move through global supply chains, the compliance infrastructure that is supposed to prevent them from reaching sanctioned destinations, and the risk that the seizure now imports into every transaction that touches Chinese manufacturing on one end and a remotely sensitive destination on the other. I have watched sanctions enforcement evolve across multiple administrations and multiple regimes, from the COCOM controls of the Cold War through the Iran sanctions architecture of the 2010s through the current secondary sanctions framework. What the forensic record shows is that every major escalation in sanctions enforcement produces a specific and predictable market response, a period of compliance paralysis in which legitimate trade is disrupted, followed by a recalibration in which the gray zone narrows, the compliance costs increase, and the entities willing to operate in the remaining gray zone become fewer but more sophisticated. The seizure of a Chinese-origin vessel carrying dual-use equipment for Iran is the kind of enforcement event that triggers that cycle. Let me show you what this cycle looks like from the inside. One sentence. The seizure of a Chinese-origin vessel carrying dual-use equipment for Iran marks the moment the U.S. China proxy conflict over Iranian sanctions enforcement became operationally direct, producing a specific pattern of Chinese public versus private response whose gap is itself the most important information signal for anyone managing trade and sanctions compliance risk in the current environment. Start with what dual use actually means legally, because the term is used in the coverage as if its meaning is self-evident, and it is not. Under U.S. export control law, specifically the Export Administration Regulations administered by the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, dual-use items are goods, software, and technology that have legitimate commercial applications but can also be used for military or weapons of mass destruction purposes. The Dual-Use Control List, the Commerce Control List, contains thousands of specific items classified by Export Control Classification Number, each with specific license requirements for exports to specific destinations. Iran appears on multiple U.S. restricted country lists. Items destined for Iran that appear on the Commerce Control List require an export license that, in practice, is almost never granted. The enforcement mechanism applies not just to direct exports from the United States, but to re-exports, the movement of U.S. origin items or items containing U.S. origin technology from third countries to Iran. This extraterritorial reach is the legal basis on which the United States claims jurisdiction over transactions that may never touch American soil or American financial institutions. The specific equipment described as dual use in the seizure reporting has not been publicly detailed beyond that characterization, a deliberate choice by the U.S. government that tells its own forensic story. When the government specifies what was seized, it enables the supplier to adapt, to redesign the item to fall outside the controlled category, to route it through different intermediaries, to fragment the shipment into components below individual thresholds. Maintaining the vagueness of dual use preserves enforcement flexibility. It also creates a specific compliance problem for any finance-minded actor. You cannot screen for something whose specific characteristics have not been publicly defined. Now map the Chinese public versus private response architecture, because this gap is the story, and it is the story that the finance-minded person needs to read accurately to assess their own risk exposure. Chinese public responses to sanctions enforcement events involving Chinese origin goods follow a documented template: formal denial that Chinese law was violated, a statement that China opposes the unilateral imposition of sanctions outside the UN Security Council framework, a characterization of the enforcement action as illegal under international law, and a demand for the release of the seized vessel and compensation for damages. All of those elements are predictable. All of them will appear in the public record within 48 hours of this seizure. None of them reflect what China is actually doing about the transaction. The private response is different and is the one with operational significance. Within the Chinese government's internal review process, the seizure will trigger a specific set of questions. Which entity shipped the cargo, through which logistics chain, with what level of documentation sophistication, and with what institutional connection to Chinese state enterprises or state-adjacent entities? If the answer to the last question is that the shipment ran through a private trading company with no direct state enterprise connection, Beijing's private response is relief. The state is insulated, the entity is expendable, and the enforcement action can be absorbed without systemic disruption. If the answer is that the shipment has institutional connections that reach into state-adjacent entities, Beijing's private response is a rapid internal effort to establish and document deniability before the U.S. government's forensic reconstruction of the logistics chain reaches those connections. The gap between the public response, formal denial, legal objection, demand for compensation, and the private response, internal deniability management, logistics chain review, entity sacrificing, is the most important information signal available. Companies and financial institutions that manage China-connected trade risk need to read that gap rather than the public statement. A Chinese government that is genuinely uninvolved in the transaction produces a public response and a private response that are broadly consistent. A Chinese government that is managing exposure produces a public response that is maximally aggressive and a private response that is operationally defensive. The aggressiveness of the public denial is, counterintuitively, inversely correlated with the cleanliness of the private situation. Now map the shipping and logistics chain that moved this equipment, because the chain architecture is itself a compliance risk signal for anyone in the trade finance space. The standard template for Chinese origin dual-use goods reaching Iran involves at least 3 intermediate steps: a Chinese manufacturer or trader who is the original supplier, a third-country intermediary, most commonly in the UAE, Turkey, Malaysia, or Hong Kong, who receives the goods and re-exports them with modified documentation, and a final leg carrier that delivers to an Iranian end user through the shadow logistics network. Each step in the chain is designed to create legal distance between the Chinese original supplier and the Iranian end user. The manufacturer sells to a legitimate-seeming intermediary and obtains an end-user certificate that identifies a non-sanctioned destination. The intermediary re-exports with documentation that may describe the goods differently: industrial components, spare parts, manufacturing equipment, and routes them through jurisdictions with limited customs inspection capacity. The final leg uses vessels and logistics providers operating in the gray zone of sanctions compliance, often registered in flag of convenience jurisdictions with minimal oversight. What the seizure documentation will ultimately reveal, and what the finance community needs to understand now, before that documentation is public, is where in the chain the enforcement action occurred and what the documentation at that point in the chain showed. A seizure at the final leg, with clean documentation up to the point of seizure, is an enforcement success, but a limited one. It catches the execution without exposing the architecture. A seizure with documentation that traces back through the intermediate steps to the original supplier is a different kind of enforcement event, one that gives the U.S. government evidentiary material for secondary sanctions designations of the intermediate entities and potentially the original supplier. That kind of seizure changes the compliance calculus across the entire category of transactions that used similar chain architectures. Now map the historical comparative that gives the finance-minded person the most useful framework for assessing what comes next. The seizure of Chinese-origin dual-use goods for Iran is not unprecedented. The historical record includes several comparable enforcement events, whose aftermath is documented and instructive. The 2019 designation of COSCO Shipping Tanker, a subsidiary of China's state-owned shipping conglomerate, for transporting Iranian crude in violation of U.S. sanctions, produced a specific market response. A sharp spike in tanker rates globally as legitimate shipping companies rushed to verify that their vessels had no exposure to COSCO-connected contracts, a temporary paralysis in tanker spot market availability, and a recalibration of the premium required to ensure vessels operating in sanctionable trade lanes. The designation lasted months before being reversed. The market disruption it caused was real, measurable, and directly traceable to the enforcement action. The 2020 to 2022 wave of secondary sanctions designations against Chinese companies involved in Iranian petrochemical trade produced a documented shift in the architecture of Chinese-Iranian trade. The transactions became more complex, the intermediate layers multiplied, the documentation sophistication increased, and the entities willing to absorb designation risk became smaller and more specialized. The net effect was not to stop the trade, it continued at roughly similar volumes, but to increase the compliance overhead and concentrate the risk in a smaller set of entities operating further from any institutional Chinese connection. The current seizure will produce a version of that same cycle, with one important difference. The Chinese institutional involvement implied by the origin of the vessel means that the secondary sanctions exposure is potentially broader than in previous enforcement cycles. If the evidentiary chain reaches Chinese state-adjacent entities, the designation risk extends to those entities' global commercial relationships, not just their Iran-connected activities. That is the tail risk that the finance community has not yet fully priced. Now, map what this does to every active diplomatic track. Because the seizure does not occur in isolation from the Omani back-channel, the Chinese-facilitated Saudi message to Tehran, and the broader diplomatic architecture we have been tracing across this video series. Each of those tracks was premised on a certain level of mutual tolerance, an implicit understanding that enforcement actions would remain below the threshold of direct Chinese institutional implication. The seizure of a Chinese-origin vessel with Chinese documentation challenges that premise. The Omani back-channel specifically, the channel's value rests on the willingness of both Washington and Tehran to treat it as a space insulated from other escalatory dynamics. A seizure event that implicates Chinese-origin goods in Iranian sanctions violations elevates the political cost to Washington of making concessions through the Omani channel, because any concession made while publicly managing a Chinese-origin seizure is domestically frameable as rewarding the behavior the seizure was designed to punish. The diplomatic space for an Omani-facilitated compromise narrows precisely as the enforcement action broadens. The Xi Salman calls utility. Beijing's positioning as a constructive diplomatic actor, the actor who called Riyadh and contributed to de-escalation, is complicated by evidence that Chinese-origin goods were moving through the logistics chain toward Iran at the same time as the diplomatic engagement. Managing both narratives simultaneously requires a level of message discipline that is difficult to sustain when enforcement actions are producing evidentiary documentation that the other narrative is happening in parallel. The gap between the diplomatic China and the logistics chain China is the gap that this seizure makes visible. The forensic story that the finance community needs to internalize from this seizure is one that I have watched play out across multiple enforcement cycles. The moment that sanctions enforcement moves from targeting the execution layer, the ships, the intermediaries, the final leg carriers, to targeting the institutional layer, the state-adjacent entities, the banking connections, the procurement networks, the compliance cost curve for the entire category of China-connected trade changes slope. It does not become vertical. It becomes steeper, and steeper compliance cost curves change behavior not at the marginal entity. The trading company operating in the gray zone, which has already priced designation risk into its business model, but at the institutional entity, the bank that provides trade finance, the insurer that underwrites the cargo, the logistics company that cannot afford to be in the same documentation chain as a designated entity. The specific compliance actions that institutional actors take in the weeks following a seizure event of this kind are documented across previous enforcement cycles. Trade finance banks tighten their customer due diligence requirements for transactions involving Chinese-origin goods transiting through UAE, Turkish, Malaysian, or Hong Kong intermediaries. Insurance underwriters add exclusion clauses or premium loadings for cargo moving through logistics chains with documentary characteristics similar to those in the seized shipment. Freight forwarders increase their beneficial ownership verification requirements for shipments with origin-destination combinations that match sanctionable trade patterns. Each of those institutional responses increases the friction on legitimate trade in the same geographic and commodity corridors, not just the sanctionable trade that the enforcement was targeting. That collateral friction is the mechanism through which a single seizure event becomes a systemic market risk factor. It is the part of the story that the geopolitical coverage almost never addresses, but that every CFO, every trade finance officer, and every supply chain manager with China-connected exposure needs to be modeling right now. The United States faces the institutional tension that has defined every escalation in China-related sanctions enforcement. The more effective the enforcement, the greater the cost to legitimate trade in the same corridors, and the greater the pressure from American businesses with Chinese supply chain exposure to roll back the enforcement before it disrupts their operations. The domestic political economy of sanctions enforcement has always limited its effectiveness at the most consequential layer, the institutional layer where Chinese state-adjacent entities operate, because the businesses that would absorb the collateral damage of that enforcement are also the businesses with the most direct access to the administration's economic policymakers. China faces the mirror image tension. The more aggressively it defends Chinese entities involved in the logistics chain, the more it confirms the U.S. government's characterization of institutional Chinese involvement in Iranian sanctions evasion, and the more it undermines its own positioning as a constructive diplomatic actor managing the Gulf crisis. The private response needs to be deniability management. The public response needs to be righteous indignation. Executing both simultaneously with the evidentiary documentation from the seizure available to journalists and analysts is a message discipline challenge of a specific and uncomfortable kind. Iran is the actor most directly affected by this seizure in the near term, not because of the specific equipment that was seized, but because the exposure of the logistics chain architecture puts pressure on the supply networks that have been moving dual-use goods toward Iranian end users across the entire range of categories, not just this specific shipment. A seizure that triggers a compliance tightening cycle at the institutional actor level reduces the flow of goods across the entire category of China-connected dual-use trade toward Iran. That is a supply disruption with military and industrial implications that the public coverage will not connect to this specific enforcement action. Scenario 1. The documentation chain from the seized vessel does not reach Chinese state-adjacent entities. The U.S. government designates the immediate shipping entities and intermediaries involved in the specific transaction. China's private response is relief. The public response is righteous indignation. The compliance tightening cycle at the institutional level is real but limited in scope. It affects the specific corridor and documentation pattern of this transaction without expanding to the broader category of China-connected dual-use trade. The Omani backchannel and the diplomatic tracks are disrupted but not collapsed. This is the most contained outcome. Scenario 2. The documentation chain reaches Chinese state-adjacent entities. The U.S. government faces the decision of whether to designate those entities, producing a direct U.S. China confrontation with systemic trade consequences, or to use the evidentiary material as leverage in diplomatic negotiations without making the designations public. If designations occur, the compliance tightening cycle at the institutional level is steep and broad. Banks, insurers, and logistics companies with Chinese state-adjacent exposure retrench across all categories of trade with similar institutional characteristics. If designations are withheld as diplomatic leverage, the material changes the negotiating dynamic in every active diplomatic track, particularly the Omani backchannel, which now operates with the knowledge that Washington holds evidentiary documentation of Chinese institutional involvement in Iranian sanctions evasion. Scenario 3. China retaliates against the seizure with a reciprocal enforcement action. Beijing's enforcement toolkit includes the ability to designate entities under Chinese law, restrict market access for specific companies, or apply the Chinese anti-foreign sanctions law, which creates legal liability for Chinese entities that comply with foreign sanctions. A reciprocal enforcement action would force a direct confrontation between U.S. and Chinese regulatory jurisdictions in ways that every multinational corporation operating in both markets would need to manage simultaneously. This scenario is unlikely in the near term, but maps the outer boundary of the escalation trajectory. Scenario 4. The seizure becomes the catalyst for a new compliance framework negotiated between Washington and Beijing, a bilateral understanding on the scope of sanctions enforcement that creates clearer rules for Chinese entities and reduces the current legal ambiguity that makes the gray zone commercially viable. This is the most constructive outcome and the one least supported by current political dynamics on either side. It requires Washington to acknowledge limits on extraterritorial enforcement and Beijing to accept some accountability for Chinese origin goods reaching sanctioned destinations. Both acknowledgments are politically costly, but the alternative, a permanent escalation cycle in which each enforcement action triggers a counter-move, is economically costly in ways that both sides' business communities understand. If you are finance-minded and managing exposure to China-connected trade, whether as a trade finance provider, a supply chain manager, an insurer, or an investor in sectors with Chinese manufacturing dependencies, the specific compliance risk signal from this seizure is the following. In the next 4 to 6 weeks, expect a tightening of due diligence requirements at the institutional actor level for transactions with the following characteristics: Chinese origin goods, transit through UAE, Turkish, Malaysian, or Hong Kong intermediaries, end destinations in countries on U.S. restricted lists or with documented diversion risk to those countries. The tightening will not be announced. It will appear as longer processing times, additional documentation requests, new beneficial ownership verification requirements, and in some cases quiet decisions to exit specific transaction categories entirely. The premium for clean documentation, transaction chains with full beneficial ownership transparency, verifiable end-user certificates, and logistics providers with documented sanctions compliance programs will increase. The discount for transactions with documentation gaps, incomplete beneficial ownership chains, intermediaries in high diversion risk jurisdictions, carriers without established compliance track records, will widen. The spread between those two pricing points is the compliance risk premium that this seizure has just expanded. Managing that spread is the practical financial implication of what happened when that vessel was boarded. The longer-range financial implication, and the one that the generational witness sees most clearly, is that the seizure represents a step change in the level of U.S. China confrontation over sanctions enforcement that will not be walked back to the pre-seizure baseline. Once a Chinese origin vessel carrying dual-use equipment for Iran has been seized in international waters, the implicit contract that governed the previous level of tolerance has been broken. Broken contracts do not reconstitute themselves. They are renegotiated on new terms, under new conditions, with the enforcement event as the baseline from which both parties calculate what the new terms need to be. The finance community needs to model the new baseline, not the one that existed yesterday. Let me pull this together. The ship came from China. It was carrying dual-use equipment. The U.S. government seized it. The coverage is treating this as a sanctions enforcement story. The forensic story is different. It is the moment the U.S.-China proxy conflict over Iranian sanctions evasion became operationally direct, producing a broken contract between Washington and Beijing, whose renegotiation will define the compliance landscape for China-connected trade across every sector that touches dual-use categories. The gap between China's public response, which will be aggressive, legally framed, and designed for domestic and international audiences, and its private response, which will be operationally defensive, focused on establishing deniability, and aimed at sacrificing the most exposed entities while insulating institutional connections, is the most important signal available to anyone managing compliance risk in this environment. The aggressiveness of the public denial is the data point. The sophistication of the private deniability management is the real information. I have watched broken contracts and sanctions enforcement play out across enough enforcement cycles to know what comes next. The compliance costs increase. The gray zone narrows but does not disappear. It migrates to more sophisticated operators and more complex architectures. The institutional actors who have been managing marginal exposure to the gray zone without adequate documentation are the ones who absorb the most painful recalibration. And the evidentiary material from the seized vessel becomes a permanent fixture in the enforcement landscape, available for use as diplomatic leverage, as the basis for future designations, and as the documented record of a day on which the implicit contract between Washington and Beijing over Iranian sanctions enforcement was broken and the renegotiation of its successor began. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If the documentation chain from this seizure reaches Chinese state-adjacent entities, which is the scenario that changes the systemic trade risk calculus, what is the single most important compliance action a finance institution with China-connected trade exposure should take in the next 30 days? Not a general compliance improvement. A specific targeted action based on the specific risk that this seizure has introduced. Leave your answer in the comments. The most operationally precise responses I will read in the follow-up.